Hey guys, tonight's story begins with something that sounds almost cozy at first. Sleeping above a medieval stable. But in the Middle Ages, the warmth rising through the floorboards came with smells, sounds, insects, smoke, damp straw, restless animals, and the quiet reminder that comfort was often built directly on top of discomfort. Before we settle into that world, let me know where you're watching from and what corner of history you'd like us to wander into next. If you enjoy thoughtful, long-form history, a like is a simple way to support it. And if you'd like more calm, quietly fascinating journeys into the past, you're very welcome to subscribe. So let's step carefully into a medieval evening, when the sun was lowering behind timber roofs and thatch, when the day's work was not quite finished, and when sleep was less a private escape than a practical arrangement with animals, weather, darkness, and the hard limits of ordinary life. To understand what it was like to sleep above a stable, we have to begin with a simple truth that modern viewers often miss. Medieval people did not always divide the world into clean categories the way we do now. Home, workplace, storage room, shelter, and animal housing could sit very close together, sometimes under the same roof, not because people were careless, but because space, heat, labor, money, and survival all pressed in at once. In a colder season, the body heat of animals mattered. A horse, an ox, a cow, a mule, or even smaller livestock could change the temperature of a building in subtle but meaningful ways. The stable below was not merely a place of dirt and noise. It was also a source of warmth, wealth, movement, and security. Animals were not background scenery in medieval life. They were engines, companions, investments, and sometimes the difference between a household that could work its land and one that could not. So when someone slept above a stable, they were not simply enduring a strange inconvenience. They were living inside an economy where every wall, beam, and sleeping place had to justify itself. Picture the building first. Not a grand castle chamber, not the romantic inn of a polished painting, but a practical structure of timber, wattle, daub, stone, thatch, or tile, depending on the region and wealth of the owner. The lower level might hold horses for travelers, pack animals for merchants, or the household's own livestock. The upper floor, if there was one, might be reached by a ladder, a steep stair, or an exterior wooden step. It might serve as a hayloft, a storage room, a sleeping loft, or all three at once. The floor between human sleeper and animal body was not always thick. It might be made of wooden planks, sometimes with gaps, sometimes warped by damp, sometimes creaking under weight. Below, hooves shifted in straw. Chains or ropes moved against posts. Leather tack hung nearby. Somewhere in the dark, an animal breathed with a heavy, slow rhythm, then stamped suddenly at a fly, a rat, or an irritation only it could feel. To modern ears, that sounds almost impossible to rest through. But medieval sleep did not require silence in the modern sense. It unfolded in a world that was rarely quiet. Dogs barked, carts passed, wind entered through shutters and cracks. Bells marked time. People coughed, whispered, prayed, rose before dawn, and sometimes woke in the middle of the night as part of an ordinary sleep pattern. Silence, privacy, and a sealed bedroom were luxuries many people did not expect. The first thing you would notice if you climbed into that upper space near evening would probably be the smell. Not just one smell, but layers of it. Warm animal hide, old straw, fresh straw, damp wood, hay dust, urine soaked into floor or earth, manure waiting to be cleared, leather, sweat, smoke from a hearth nearby, perhaps ale, wool clothing, and the sour traces of human life in close quarters. The smell would not always be unbearable. A well-kept stable could be managed with care. Straw could be changed. Manure could be removed. Doors could be opened. But the idea of clean separation between the human world and the animal world was much weaker than ours. And yet, the smell also carried information. A medieval person familiar with animals could read it more finely than we might. Too much damp might mean rot. A sick animal could smell different. Bad bedding could mean neglect. A stable was not just dirty or clean. It was healthy or unhealthy, orderly or careless, prosperous or strained. In that sense, the very discomfort that modern people might find overwhelming was part of a daily awareness of survival. Above the stable, the sleeping place might be warmer than an isolated chamber. This is one of the quiet contradictions of the arrangement. The same animals that produced the noise, smell, flies, and dampness also produced heat. In winter, this mattered greatly. Medieval buildings lost warmth easily. Glass windows were rare for ordinary homes. Shutters helped, but wind found its way in. Fires consumed fuel, and fuel required labor to gather or money to buy. So sleeping above animals could be an uncomfortable form of efficiency. The floor might be warmer than the air. The loft might hold the day's stored hay, which itself acted as insulation. If the sleeper was a servant, groom, traveler, or poorer member of a household, the stable loft could be far better than sleeping outside, in a barn open to the wind, or on a floor near a doorway. Comfort is always relative. In medieval life, that relativity shaped almost everything. A bed, too, might not mean what we imagine. For wealthier people, a bed could be a valuable object with a frame, mattress, textiles, curtains, and social meaning. For humbler sleepers, bedding might be straw, hay, sacks, cloaks, blankets, or a simple pallet. In an inn, the space above a stable might be used by servants, lower-paying travelers, stable hands, or those who needed to stay close to the animals. In rural households, a loft might be shared with stored goods, tools, grain, or bundles of fodder. You might lie down still dressed, removing only what was practical. Clothing itself was part of warmth. Linen undergarments, wool tunics, hose, cloaks, caps, and coverings all mattered. The cold did not politely remain outside the story. It entered every decision. To sleep was to negotiate with temperature. And then came the sounds. At first, the stable below might be active. Someone brings in the animals. A groom scrapes mud from hooves. A horse blows air through its nostrils. Buckles and bits are checked. Water is carried. Straw is forked into place. A tired traveler speaks softly to an innkeeper. A servant complains under breath. A door beam is dropped into place. Somewhere a lantern is covered or extinguished. Then gradually the building settles. But a stable never becomes fully still. Animals shift their weight through the night. A horse may doze standing, then move. Cattle breathe, chew, and stir. Rats may scratch inside thatch, wall, or grain. The sleeper above hears the living machinery of the household continuing in darkness. There is a subtle point here, and it is one of the reasons this topic is more interesting than it first appears. Sleeping above a stable was not merely sleeping above animals. It was sleeping above value. A good horse could be expensive. Oxen could represent agricultural power. Livestock could be food, transport, status, labor, and future income. To be near them at night could also be a kind of guarding. The person above the stable might be there because that was the only available space. But they might also be there because someone had to listen. A thief, a fire, a sick animal, a loose rope, a panicked horse, a foaling mare, a broken latch. These were not small matters. In a world without electric alarms, proximity was protection. The sleeping body became part of the household's security system. Even rest had a duty attached to it. That is one of the deeper differences between medieval and modern sleep. For many people today, sleep is imagined as protected personal time. In much of the medieval world, sleep was porous. It could be interrupted by work, prayer, danger, weather, animals, children, bells, illness, and obligation. A person sleeping above a stable did not fully leave the working day behind. The labor of the animals below continued to define the space, even after darkness came. The stable itself could vary enormously. In a monastery, animals might be connected to carefully organized estates. In a manor, the stabling of horses carried hierarchy. In a town, an inn stable might be crowded, commercial, and full of travelers' gear. In a peasant household, animal housing might be integrated with the domestic structure in ways that seem startling now but made practical sense then. Across Europe, local climate and building traditions mattered. A stable in a damp English village, a roadside inn in France, a German town, or an alpine settlement would not feel identical. Still, the broad pattern remains. Humans and animals often lived closer together than modern comfort would allow. The closeness had consequences. Flies and fleas were constant possibilities. Lice were part of ordinary life for many people, and bedding could carry unwelcome movement. Hay could scratch the skin. Dust could irritate the lungs. Dampness could creep into blankets. The smell of ammonia from urine could sting. If the roof leaked, stored fodder might spoil. If the lower stable was badly drained, moisture rose. If the upper loft was packed with hay, it could be warm but also dangerous near flame. Fire was one of the great silent fears of medieval life. A stable loft with dry hay, wooden beams, straw bedding, and a lantern was a place where carelessness could become disaster. Light at night was precious but dangerous. Candles cost money. Rushlights were dim and smoky. Lanterns had to be handled carefully. A sleepy person carrying flame through a building full of dry material could destroy not only a bed, but animals, tools, food stores, and the roof over a household's head. So darkness itself became part of safety. Once the light was gone, the loft might be almost completely black. Not the soft darkness of a modern bedroom with a window glow or distant streetlight, but a thick rural or medieval urban darkness broken only by moonlight through cracks, embers from another room, or the faint outline of a doorway. In such darkness, familiar sounds mattered. The stable's breathing, creaking, and shifting became a map. And there is something quietly intimate about that. Not romantic exactly, more physical, more practical. The sleeper knew the building by sound and touch. The ladder rung, the low beam, the place where a plank bent, the corner where the draft entered, the smell of fresh hay against older straw. Life was not abstract. It was made of surfaces. For travelers, the experience could be different again. A medieval inn was not a hotel in the modern sense. Could be crowded, smoky, noisy, and socially mixed. Privacy depended heavily on money and status. Wealthier travelers might obtain better rooms. Poorer travelers, servants, apprentices, carriers, pilgrims, or hired men might sleep where space allowed. Sometimes that meant near animals. Sometimes it meant sharing beds, benches, floors, or lofts. Imagine arriving after a long day on the road. Your clothes are damp. Your boots are dirty. Your animal, if you have one, is tired and needs care before you do. Roads have been rough. Inns are uncertain. Prices vary. Trust is limited. The stable may smell harsh, but it offers shelter, and shelter is no small thing. Above the animals, wrapped in your cloak, you may hear conversations below in fragments. A hostler muttering, a horse resisting, coins counted, a door closed against the night. You are not comfortable by modern standards, but you are inside. That matters. This is where modern misunderstanding often begins. We imagine discomfort as failure. Medieval people often understood discomfort as normal, or at least as a condition to be managed rather than eliminated. That does not mean they enjoyed filth or cold. Medieval people complained, adapted, cleaned, repaired, sought warmth, valued good bedding, and recognized bad smells and poor conditions. But the threshold of acceptable hardship was different because the available alternatives were different. In many cases, sleeping above a stable was not the worst arrangement. It might be preferable to sleeping in the open, or in a crowded common hall, or near strangers whose intentions were uncertain. Animals could be noisy, but they were also familiar. A horse shifting below you might be less troubling than a drunk stranger beside you. There is another layer to this class. Who slept above the stable tells us a great deal about rank. In a wealthy household, servants might sleep close to the areas they served. A groom near the horses, a worker near stores, a lower status traveler in the cheaper space. Sleeping arrangements were maps of social order. The best beds, warmest chambers, and most private spaces belonged to those with power, wealth, or honor. The more marginal your position, the more likely your body was placed near work, storage, animals, smoke, doors, and disturbance. But class was not the only factor. Sometimes function outweighed status. Even an important journey required practical care of animals. A mounted traveler depended on the health and security of the horse. A merchant depended on pack animals and goods. A messenger could not afford a lost mount. In that sense, the stable was not lowly because it smelled. It was central because so much depended on it. This is one of the gentle reversals of medieval daily life. The places we might consider dirty or secondary were often among the most economically important spaces on a property. The stable connected the household to the road. It held movement. It held labor. It held transport. It held manure which could become fertilizer. It held risk. It held wealth that breathed and could die. Above it, a person tried to sleep. As the night deepened, temperature would become more noticeable. Warmth from below might rise unevenly. A body lying on straw or a pallet could feel heat in one place and draft in another. The feet might be cold. The face might be exposed. Breath could cloud faintly in the coldest months. Blankets might smell of wool, smoke, sweat, and previous use. If the sleeper had a cap, they might pull it low. If they had a cloak, they might fold it under and over themselves, turning one garment into mattress and cover. The hayloft, when used for sleep, carried its own discomforts. Hay was valuable and not simply a soft rustic cushion. Could poke, crackle, and shed dust. Could hide insects. Could make breathing unpleasant for some. It could also be forbidden or carefully controlled if it belonged to the household or inn. A traveler could not simply sprawl through valuable fodder without consequence. Every material had purpose. Even straw bedding had a life cycle. Fresh straw was cleaner, springier, and more pleasant. Old straw became flattened, damp, dirty, and alive with pests. Changing it required labor and supply. A good innkeeper or household manager understood this. A careless one revealed themselves quickly. So the quality of sleep above a stable depended on a chain of human decisions made long before nightfall. Was the stable mucked out? Was the roof sound? Was the bedding changed? Were animals healthy? Was hay stored dry? Were guests crowded in? Was the ladder safe? Were fires controlled? Was the season wet, freezing, or mild? A single phrase, sleeping above a medieval stable, hides an entire system, and that system began before sunset. By late afternoon, the medieval day was already bending toward survival. Animals had to be fed and watered. Equipment had to be checked. Doors had to be secured. In rural settings, livestock might be brought in from pasture or work. In towns, stables near inns or merchant yards might receive animals from roads that were muddy, rutted, and dangerous after dark. A horse could not simply be parked like a machine. It required attention, and failure could be expensive. A stable hand, servant, child, or traveler might move through this twilight routine with a familiarity that modern people rarely possess. The smell of sweat on an animal after labor, the warmth under a mane, the mud packed around hooves, the need to keep feed dry, the danger of a kick in low light, the importance of tying an animal properly, not too tight, not too loose, the way one restless animal could unsettle others. All of this shaped the sleeper's night, because above the stable you did not sleep above a quiet room. You slept above the results of the day's labor. And if the day had been wet, the night carried wetness. If roads were muddy, mud entered with the animals. If the harvest was poor, fodder might be rationed. If the household was under pressure, cleaning might be delayed. If travelers were many, the stable could be crowded. If winter was harsh, every warm corner was more contested. This makes the scene more human. It was not just unpleasant because medieval people lacked modern hygiene. It was variable because they were constantly balancing limited resources. The body adjusted where it could. A person might learn to sleep through stamping hooves but wake instantly at the wrong kind of sound. A snap, a frightened animal, a door opening, a stranger's movement. Medieval sleep could be alert sleep. It did not always mean unconscious surrender. In insecure settings, especially on the road, people rested with one part of the mind listening. This matters for a history of ordinary life because the past is often taught through kings, battles, laws, and cathedrals. But the real texture of an era lives in places like this. A loft above animals, where a person's need for warmth meets the smell of manure, where valuable horses breathe beneath rough planks, where the night is both shelter and discomfort. And once we understand that, the medieval stable stops being a picturesque background and becomes something more revealing. A place where economy, class, architecture, travel, labor, weather, and sleep all meet in the dark. For a poor traveler, this sleeping place could be humiliating, but also a relief. For a stable boy, it might be routine. For a servant, it might be part of duty. For an innkeeper, it might be an efficient use of space. For the animals below, the human above mattered only when food arrived, ropes were adjusted, or danger came near. There is a quiet humility in that arrangement. Human beings were not as separated from the rest of life as they often are now. They heard animals digesting. They smelled the work that fed them. They slept near the sources of their own movement and livelihood. The boundary between comfort and utility was thin, sometimes only a plank floor. And as the hours passed, the stable loft became its own little world. Outside, the village or town settled. A late cart might pass. Rain might begin against the roof. Wind might push smoke downward. Somewhere, a church bell might mark a night hour, though not always with perfect regularity. Dogs might answer one another. A baby might cry in a nearby house. The animals below would continue their small movements, half asleep and half alert. The sleeper above might wake, turn, and listen. Perhaps the first sleep had ended, as it often did in pre-modern patterns. There might be a period of quiet wakefulness in the night, a time for prayer, thought, small tasks, or simply waiting for sleep to return. In that wakeful darkness, the stable below would feel larger than it had in daylight. Each sound would be sharper. The mind might drift toward worries. The road ahead, the cost of lodging, the health of an animal, the weather, the safety of goods, the work waiting at dawn. Because dawn would come early. Medieval sleep was often tied closely to labor and light. When daylight was needed for work, wasting it carried a cost. Animals needed care before people could fully begin the day. A traveler could not depart until a horse was fed, watered, checked, and saddled. A household could not ignore the stable simply because humans were tired. So even before morning fully arrived, the lower level might wake first. A horse stirs. A latch lifts. Someone enters with cold air clinging to their clothes. Straw moves. A bucket knocks. An animal exhales heavily. The sleeper above hears the day beginning underneath them before they are ready to rise. And this may be the most accurate way to imagine sleeping above a medieval stable. Not as a single night of comic misery, and not as rustic charm, but as a practical sleep, interrupted and scented by work. It was rest placed directly over labor. It was warmth borrowed from animals. It was privacy sacrificed to necessity. It was discomfort accepted because the alternatives could be worse. The modern bedroom is often designed to hide the systems that support it. Heating comes silently through vents. Food arrives from distant supply chains. Transport waits outside as a machine. Waste disappears through pipes. Animals, if present at all, are companions rather than engines of survival. But in the medieval stable loft, none of those systems were hidden. The warmth had a body. The transport had breath. The wealth could kick, fall sick, or be stolen. The smell of work rose through the floorboards. The night reminded you where comfort came from. That is why this small sleeping arrangement opens such a wide door into medieval life. It shows us that the past was not simply dirtier, darker, or harder, though it could be all three. It was organized around different assumptions. People made choices within limits. They valued warmth, safety, and practicality in ways that can seem strange until we feel the pressure of their world. And once we feel that pressure, the scene becomes less like a curiosity and more like a lesson in everyday realism. A person lying above the stable did not need to be told that life depended on animals. They could hear it below them. They did not need an abstract lesson in economy. It was breathing under the boards. They did not need a lecture on social rank. Their sleeping place told them where they stood. Still, even within hardship, there could be small comforts. The warmth rising from below. The smell of fresh hay instead of old straw. The relief of a roof in heavy rain. The familiar breathing of an animal known for years. The safety of a locked door. A cloak folded just right beneath the shoulder. The knowledge that morning work, however demanding, had not yet arrived. Medieval life was not one continuous misery. It was a world of rough textures, uneven comforts, and constant negotiation. People laughed, rested, adapted, and found normality where we might only see discomfort. That is important to remember, because pity alone can flatten the past. So can romance. The truth usually lives somewhere quieter, in the middle. And in that middle place, above the stable, the night goes on. The sleeper turns again. The boards answer with a faint creak. Below, an animal shifts its weight, then settles. The air is thick, not clean, but warm enough. The dark is deep, but familiar. Somewhere beyond the walls, the road waits for morning, and with it the next movement of people. Goods, messages, animals, and work. For now, the building holds them all together. Human above, animals below. Hay in the corners, tools along the wall, damp rising, warmth rising, sleep coming and going in slow, uneven waves. And as we stay with this scene a little longer, the stable begins to reveal something even broader about the medieval world. The way ordinary people built their nights around what they could not afford to lose. And once something could not be afforded to lose, it tended to remain physically close. That principle shaped much more than sleeping arrangements. It influenced the layout of farms, inns, workshops, and even entire communities. Medieval people often lived nearer to the sources of their survival than modern people do. Grain was stored where it could be watched. Tools were kept where they could be reached. Animals stayed where they could be heard. The stable beneath a sleeping loft was therefore not an accident of architecture. It was part of a wider habit of keeping valuable things within the range of human senses. A strange sound in the night was information. Modern homes are filled with objects that can fail silently. Medieval households rarely had that luxury. A horse becoming agitated, a cow kicking against a partition, a sudden absence of familiar noise. These things mattered. Someone sleeping above a stable often learned to distinguish ordinary sounds from unusual ones. The difference could determine whether a person turned over and drifted back to sleep or climbed down into the darkness with a lantern. This brings us to an aspect of medieval sleep that is often overlooked. Many people imagine nighttime as a complete pause in activity. Yet, for countless medieval households, the night remained a period of low-level vigilance. The household rested, certainly, but responsibility never disappeared entirely. Livestock could become sick. A mare might begin foaling unexpectedly. A storm could damage part of the roof. Water might seep where it should not. Predators could threaten animals in more remote regions. Even in settled communities, theft remained a concern. Horses were particularly important. A good horse represented far more than transportation. Depending on the animal and the owner's circumstances, it could represent years of savings. Horses carried goods, messages, travelers, officials, merchants, and soldiers. They connected villages to markets and towns to distant regions. Losing one could create problems that extended far beyond the stable itself. For this reason, medieval records occasionally reveal disputes, fines, thefts, and legal concerns involving horses and livestock that might seem surprisingly serious to modern readers. Yet, within the economic realities of the period, such concerns were entirely rational. Imagine lying awake for a moment above the stable after midnight. The building has settled into its deepest quiet. The last conversations ended hours ago. The fire has long since burned low. The air carries the smell of hay and wood, with a faint trace of damp earth beneath it all. Then suddenly a horse below shifts violently. A hoof strikes timber. Another animal responds. For a few moments the stable becomes restless. A modern listener might assume danger, but often there was none. Animals dream. They react to noises. They become startled by movement, insects, unfamiliar scents, or changes in weather. Medieval people understood this through experience rather than theory. They spent enough time around animals to recognize their habits. The sounds below might briefly disturb sleep, but they were also reassuring in a curious way. Life continued. The stable was alive. That may seem like an obvious statement, but it is important. Many modern buildings become completely inert once people stop moving through them. Medieval structures often remained active because they housed living creatures whose rhythms did not perfectly align with human schedules. A horse might stand quietly for an hour and then begin moving. Cattle might chew cud during the night. Dogs might react to noises outside. Chickens could become unsettled by disturbances. Even rodents contributed to the soundscape. No matter how still the loft appeared, life persisted beneath it. This constant background activity shaped expectations of sleep itself. Today, many people view uninterrupted sleep as the ideal. Medieval sleep was frequently more flexible. Historians continue to debate the exact prevalence of segmented sleep patterns, but evidence suggests that many people experienced periods of wakefulness during the night. If you woke in darkness for an hour, it was not necessarily a cause for concern. The night contained its own rhythm. For someone sleeping above a stable, these waking moments could become periods of quiet observation. Perhaps moonlight entered through a crack in the wall. Perhaps rain tapped steadily against the roof. Perhaps a horse snorted below. The mind drifted. Tomorrow's work approached, but had not yet arrived. The road continued somewhere beyond the darkness. In those moments, the stable became more than a workplace. It became a companion to thought. The medieval world often appears crowded with labor when viewed from a distance, and rightly so. Work occupied much of life. Yet within that labor existed countless small periods of waiting, observing, repairing, feeding, carrying, listening, and resting. The stable sat at the center of many of those activities. A groom's day did not consist entirely of dramatic tasks. Most responsibilities were repetitive: checking feed, inspecting tack, cleaning stalls, watching for signs of illness, maintaining equipment, moving bedding, fetching water. Much of medieval survival depended upon such routines, and routines leave traces in buildings. If you entered a stable loft after years of use, you would notice worn surfaces everywhere. The ladder rungs would be smoother where hands and boots repeatedly touched them. Certain boards would creak more than others. Door handles would bear the marks of constant use. Posts might carry grooves from ropes. Even the floor itself could reveal patterns of movement. These physical traces are easy to overlook, yet they help us imagine the countless ordinary people whose names never entered chronicles. Most medieval lives survive only indirectly. A tax record, a legal dispute, an account book, property inventory, a mention in a manor court, and yet those forgotten individuals slept, worked, worried, laughed, and aged in places like these. The stable loft allows us to approach history from ground level, not through kings and battles, but through sleeping arrangements, not through grand declarations, but through practical choices. This perspective often reveals something surprisingly important. Medieval people were not constantly seeking discomfort. They were constantly seeking workable solutions. There is a difference. Sleeping above animals may seem unpleasant to us, but within the context of available resources, it often solved multiple problems simultaneously. It saved space, provided warmth, it improved security, kept valuable livestock close. It allowed workers to remain near their responsibilities. In other words, the arrangement endured because it worked. That does not mean people loved it. Medieval sources contain plenty of complaints about poor conditions, inadequate accommodations, bad smells, cold weather, and uncomfortable sleeping situations. Human beings have always preferred comfort when they could obtain it. The difference lies in expectations. A merchant arriving at an inn might hope for a decent night's sleep, but expectations were often calibrated differently than modern travelers. Comfort existed on a spectrum. A dry place could be considered good. A warm place could be considered excellent. Private place could feel luxurious. These categories often mattered more than perfect cleanliness or silence. This becomes particularly interesting when we compare different social groups. A wealthy noble traveling with servants might encounter very different accommodations than a poor laborer. Yet even wealth did not fully remove a person from the realities of animal-powered society. Horses remained essential. Transportation depended upon them. Messages depended upon them. Military power depended upon them. Trade depended upon them. Even privileged individuals often spent considerable time near stables simply because stables occupied a central position within medieval life. This challenges another common misconception. Modern depictions sometimes separate elite and ordinary worlds too sharply. In reality, the same animals supported both. The differences lay in scale, quality, and comfort rather than complete separation. A noble stable might be larger, cleaner, and better managed. The horses might be superior. The bedding might be fresher. The buildings might be stronger. Yet the fundamental relationship remained recognizable. Animals still required care. Feed still required storage. Manure still required removal. Night still brought uncertainty. As the hours before dawn approached, the atmosphere inside a stable complex could change again. Temperatures often reached their lowest point. Moisture gathered. The smell of animals became more noticeable in still air. Breath condensed faintly. Those sleeping above might pull blankets tighter or curl deeper into cloaks. Outside, the world remained dark. Inside, the animals waited. Then came one of the most important moments of the medieval day. The first signs of morning. Not sunrise itself. Something earlier. The transition before sunrise. The stable often sensed it before the household fully did. Animals respond to subtle changes in light and routine. They become active before humans consciously register dawn. A horse that had stood quietly for hours might begin shifting again. Livestock expected feeding. The stable slowly awakened. For someone sleeping above it, this awakening became impossible to ignore. A new sound emerged. Not the random noises of the night. Purposeful sounds. The sounds of preparation. A door opening. Footsteps approaching. A bucket being set down. The scrape of wood against wood. The beginning of another working day. This early morning period reveals something fascinating about medieval sleep. The end of rest was often determined less by personal preference than by practical necessity. Animals could not wait indefinitely. Fields could not wait indefinitely. Markets could not wait indefinitely. Travel could not wait indefinitely. The day exerted pressure long before clocks became central to daily life. Many people rose because responsibilities rose first. And nowhere was that reality more visible than in a stable. A stable was a place where biological schedules met economic schedules. The animals needed food. The household needed labor. The road needed movement. The market needed goods. Everything connected. The sleeper above the stable therefore occupied a surprisingly revealing position within medieval society. Not at the center of political power. Not at the edge of society either, but at a crossroads where many essential systems met. Agriculture, transportation, trade, household management, travel, communication, all pass through spaces like these. And once we begin looking at the stable through that lens, another question quietly emerges. If sleeping above a stable tells us so much about ordinary life, what happened when those ordinary systems broke down? What happened during harsh winters, disease outbreaks, failed harvests, or periods of instability, when the animals below became even more precious than usual and the fragile balance between people, livestock, shelter, and survival was pushed to its limits? Because it was during those difficult years that the humble stable often became something far more important than a place to keep horses for the night. Because it was during those difficult years that the humble stable often became something far more important than a place to keep horses for the night. In prosperous times, a stable might simply support the ordinary rhythms of travel, farming, and trade. But when harvests failed, winters lingered, or disease swept through a region, the animals housed inside those walls could become among a household's most valuable possessions. In such moments, sleeping above the stable took on a different meaning. It was no longer merely practical. It could become a form of vigilance born from necessity. A failed harvest did not affect only people. It affected animals as well. Fodder supplies became uncertain. Hay stores that had seemed adequate in summer suddenly appeared insufficient by midwinter. Every bundle stored in a loft carried weight beyond its physical mass. It represented days of survival, sometimes weeks. The relationship between the sleeper and the stable changed accordingly. Imagine a particularly difficult winter. Snow lies across the landscape longer than expected. Roads become unreliable. Markets receive fewer supplies. Villages begin to calculate their reserves with increasing care. Under such conditions, the stable becomes a place of constant concern. How much feed remains? Can enough hay be spared? Which animals must be preserved at all costs? Which animals can still work? which are becoming weak. The person sleeping above the stable is not isolated from these questions. They hear them discussed. They see them reflected in daily routines. They may even participate in the difficult decisions themselves. One of the quiet realities of medieval life is that survival often depended upon planning months in advance. A successful summer did not simply produce food for immediate consumption. It produced security against future uncertainty. Haymaking, for example, was not glamorous work. It rarely appears in dramatic retellings of history, yet entire communities depended upon it. Without sufficient fodder, livestock suffered. Without livestock, fields could not be worked efficiently. Without working animals, future harvests became more difficult. The chain extended forward through time. This is one reason historians often caution against imagining medieval people as focused only on immediate concerns. Many households spent enormous energy preparing for seasons that had not yet arrived. The stable embodied that preparation. Its lofts often held winter's insurance policy stacked in the form of hay and straw. A person sleeping among those stores occupied a curious position. Above them lay part of the household's future. Beneath them stood animals essential to turning that future into reality. The arrangement seems almost symbolic. Human sleep suspended between resources and labor, between stored energy and living energy, between planning and execution. Yet to medieval people it was simply everyday life. The practical nature of medieval thinking often becomes clearer the closer we move toward ordinary experiences. Grand ideologies mattered, certainly. Religion shaped society profoundly. Politics influenced entire regions. But much of daily decision-making revolved around immediate realities. How much wood remained? How much grain remained? How healthy were the animals? Could the roof survive another storm? These concerns did not replace larger beliefs. They existed alongside them. A stable at night reflected this combination remarkably well. A person might climb into the loft after completing the evening chores. They might say a prayer before sleeping. They might think about family, obligations, or upcoming travel. Yet beneath all those thoughts remained practical awareness. The horse must be fed tomorrow. The ox must remain healthy. The hay must stay dry. The door must stay secure. The medieval world often required people to think simultaneously about spiritual concerns and material necessities. Nowhere was that balance more visible than in places where humans and animals lived in such close proximity. Disease added another layer of uncertainty. When modern people hear discussions of medieval illness, attention usually turns toward human epidemics. Yet animal disease could also be devastating. Livestock represented wealth, labor, transport, and food. A sickness among animals could ripple through an entire community. This made observation critically important. Long before scientific veterinary medicine emerged in its modern form, people relied upon experience. They watched for changes in behavior. They noticed appetite, movement, breathing, and appearance. A stable hand who spent every day around horses could recognize subtle differences that an outsider might miss. Sleeping above the stable strengthened that familiarity. The sounds became known. The routines became known. Normality became known. And because normality was known, abnormalities became easier to detect. This is another small reversal of expectation at first glance. Sleeping above a stable appears to represent inconvenience. Yet proximity also created knowledge. The closer people lived to the systems supporting their survival, the more intimately they understood those systems. A farmer knew the condition of his animals. A groom knew the habits of individual horses. An innkeeper understood the rhythms of travelers arriving and departing. Distance often reduces understanding. Closeness increases it. Medieval life frequently operated through closeness. Of course, closeness also carried risks. A stable was never entirely safe. Large animals are powerful animals. Even experienced handlers could be injured. Horses kick. Oxen can become unpredictable. Equipment fails. Animals panic. Fire remains a constant threat. The combination of hay, timber, straw, and livestock created conditions that required constant care. This is one reason stable design evolved over centuries. Builders attempted, within available resources, to reduce risks and improve efficiency. Regional variations emerged based on climate, local materials, and economic circumstances. In colder northern regions, integrating animal housing more closely with human spaces often offered practical advantages. In other areas, layouts differed according to local needs. There was no single medieval stable, just as there was no single medieval experience. This point deserves emphasis because modern imagination often compresses an entire millennium into a single image. Yet conditions varied enormously across regions, centuries, and social classes. A stable in 12th century England differed from one in 15th century Germany. A mountain village differed from a market town. An abbey differed from an inn. A manor differed from a peasant holding. The details changed, yet the underlying relationship remained remarkably consistent. Animals mattered. Their care mattered. Their survival mattered, and the spaces built around them reflected that importance. The inn stable offers an especially revealing example. When travelers entered a medieval town near dusk, one of their first concerns often involved their animals. Lodging for the traveler mattered, certainly, but lodging for the horse mattered too. In some cases, the horse may have represented a greater financial investment than many of the traveler's other possessions combined. A merchant could replace clothing. A damaged horse was another matter entirely. Consequently, reputable inns often earned trust not only through accommodations for people but through accommodations for animals. Travel literature, account books, and records occasionally reveal how important these practical concerns could be. A good stable became part of an establishment's reputation. Fresh bedding mattered. Reliable feed mattered. Competent care mattered. The traveler sleeping above the stable therefore occupied an interesting position. He remained physically close to the animal upon which tomorrow's journey depended. If something went wrong during the night, he was nearby. If the horse became distressed, he might hear it. If theft threatened, he remained within reach. The arrangement reduced uncertainty. Not entirely, but enough. And reducing uncertainty was often one of the most valuable services a medieval household or inn could provide. There is something surprisingly modern about that observation. Across centuries, people consistently seek ways to manage uncertainty. The methods change. The technologies change. The underlying desire remains. The stable loft represented one medieval solution. Not elegant, not luxurious, but functional. As dawn approached on an ordinary day, activity gradually resumed below. A groom entered carrying tools. Animals received feed. Water buckets were filled. Harnesses were inspected. The stable transitioned from nighttime shelter back into daytime workplace. The sleeper above experienced that transition directly. In many cases, the distinction between night and day was less absolute than modern people imagine. Responsibilities flowed continuously across the boundary. Sleep interrupted work, but only temporarily. This continuity helps explain why medieval people often developed such practical attitudes toward rest. Sleep was necessary. It was valued. Yet it existed within larger systems of obligation. The horse required attention whether the groom felt rested or not. The market opened whether the merchant slept well or poorly. The fields demanded labor regardless of comfort. This reality shaped expectations from childhood onward. Young people growing up around farms, manors, workshops, and inns learned quickly that animals operated according to their own schedules. Cows needed milking, horses needed feeding, livestock required care. The stable taught discipline not through abstract instruction but through daily repetition. In this sense, sleeping above a stable could become an education. A child assigned such sleeping quarters learned responsibility almost by default. Sounds carried meaning. Morning arrived early. Duties awaited. The building itself reinforced lessons about work, value, and consequence. Medieval childhood was not identical to adulthood, despite some popular misconceptions. Children played, learned, formed friendships, and experienced family life. Yet many also entered practical responsibilities earlier than modern children typically do. The stable often formed part of that process. Young helpers fetched water, carried feed, cleaned stalls, observed experienced workers, gradually absorbed knowledge. Knowledge passed through demonstration rather than formal instruction. A horse's condition was not learned from a manual. It was learned by watching, listening, repeating, correcting mistakes. Sleeping above the stable placed a person inside that learning environment almost constantly. The smells became familiar. The noises became familiar. The routines became familiar. And familiarity created competence. This is perhaps one of the most overlooked aspects of pre-modern life. People often possessed deep practical expertise in areas that modern individuals rarely encounter directly. They understood weather signs, animal behavior, seasonal rhythms, local materials, agricultural timing, not because they studied these subjects academically, but because daily survival demanded attention. The stable was one classroom among many. As morning light slowly filtered through cracks in shutters and gaps in timber, the loft revealed itself again. The darkness that had hidden imperfections during the night receded. Dust became visible. Haystacks emerged from shadow. Tools regained their shape. The sleeping place looked less mysterious and more practical. Another day had begun. Outside, roads gradually filled with movement. Farmers headed toward fields. Merchants prepared for travel. Messengers continued their routes. Animals left stables to resume work. The medieval world stirred back into motion. Yet the stable remained at the center of that movement. Without the animals housed there, much of society's daily activity would slow dramatically. This is easy to overlook because animals often appear in historical narratives as background details. In reality, they functioned as infrastructure, before engines, before railways, before automobiles, before mechanized agriculture. Animal power connected communities. And because it connected communities, people organized parts of their lives around protecting it, including where they slept. A person lying above a stable was therefore closer to the foundations of medieval society than they may have realized. Every hoofbeat below echoed larger systems. Every bundle of hay reflected future planning. Every restless night linked individual experience to broader economic realities. And nowhere would those connections become more visible than during periods when travel itself intensified, when roads grew busier, inns more crowded, and the stable beneath the sleeping loft became a crossroads through which entire streams of medieval life passed on their way to somewhere else. And nowhere would those connections become more visible than during periods when travel itself intensified, when roads grew busier, inns more crowded, and the stable beneath the sleeping loft became a crossroads through which entire streams of medieval life passed on their way to somewhere else. It is easy to imagine medieval travel as rare. For many people, long-distance journeys certainly were uncommon. Most villagers spent much of their lives within a relatively limited geographic area. Yet medieval Europe was never as static as it sometimes appears in popular imagination. Merchants moved constantly. Pilgrims crossed regions and sometimes entire countries. Messengers carried information. Clergy traveled between religious houses. Officials inspected estates. Students journeyed to centers of learning. Craftsmen searched for work. Soldiers marched. Seasonal laborers relocated when opportunities appeared. The roads were not empty, and where roads carried movement, stables became essential. A traveler arriving at an inn near sunset often entered a world already in motion. Animals needed tending. Other guests might already be settled for the evening. The smell of cooking drifted from the main building. Stable hands moved quickly to finish their tasks before darkness deepened. For someone sleeping above the stable, these arrivals transformed the atmosphere. The loft became a place where fragments of distant worlds briefly gathered. Below, horses from different regions stood side by side. One might belong to a merchant returning from a market town. Another might carry a messenger from a local lord. A third could belong to a pilgrim moving toward a famous shrine. Their owners might never meet again, yet for one night they shared the same roof. This temporary gathering of strangers is one of the most fascinating aspects of medieval inns. The stable often served as the first point of contact between traveler and establishment. Before the traveler ate, before a bed was assigned, before conversation began around a fire, attention turned to the animals. The horse came first. This was not sentimentality. It was practicality. A tired horse represented tomorrow's transportation. An injured horse represented a serious problem. A stolen horse could become a disaster. Consequently, a significant portion of the evening revolved around ensuring the animal's welfare. Feed was arranged. Water provided. Equipment checked. Sometimes minor injuries were examined. Only afterward could the traveler fully turn attention toward personal comfort. This order of priorities reveals something important about medieval life. Modern transportation generally waits passively. A car parked overnight requires little attention. A horse does not. It eats, drinks, rests, becomes ill, becomes frightened, requires care. The stable therefore remained active long after many modern garages would be silent. Imagine yourself lying in the loft above. You are not merely listening to animals. You are listening to the machinery of medieval movement. Every horse below represents a journey. Every saddle carries a story. Every set of hoofprints arriving in the yard began somewhere else. The stable becomes a quiet archive of human travel. Most of those stories vanished without record. A merchant transporting cloth, a widow visiting relatives. A young apprentice heading toward a larger town. A messenger carrying instructions. A pilgrim seeking spiritual comfort. The historical record rarely preserves their names. Yet they pass through spaces like this constantly. Sleeping above the stable meant existing close to the flow of ordinary history rather than its famous events. And ordinary history is often where the texture of life becomes clearest. The traveler who arrived exhausted at dusk may not care much about politics that evening. He cares about food, warmth, his horse, tomorrow's road. Likewise, the stable hand may know little about distant wars. His immediate concern is whether the animals have been properly fed and secured. This narrowing of attention toward practical realities is one reason everyday history feels so human. The concerns are recognizable, not identical to ours, but recognizable. People worried about possessions, health, work, safety, weather, family, travel. The stable concentrated many of those concerns in a single place. It also exposed travelers to a remarkable variety of information. Long before newspapers, radio, or digital communication, roads carried news. Not always accurate news, not always recent news, but news nonetheless. A traveler arriving from another region might bring reports of harvest conditions, market prices, political developments, military movements, outbreaks of disease, or unusual events. Such information often spread through conversation, and conversations often happened near animals. While the inn's main hall naturally hosted discussion, the stable had its own social world. Animals had to be unloaded, equipment stored, supplies checked. These tasks created opportunities for brief exchanges. A merchant might ask about road conditions ahead. Pilgrim might seek directions. A groom might share local information. The stable became part transportation hub, part information network. For the sleeper above, these conversations drifted upward through cracks in the floorboards or through open doors before night fully settled. Perhaps only fragments were heard. A mention of flooding, a rumor of conflict, discussion of a market fair, talk of unusual weather, pieces of larger stories moving through the countryside. It is a subtle detail, but an important one. People sleeping above stables were often physically closer to the movement of information than we might assume. The road connected communities. The stable connected the road to the household. This role became especially important during pilgrimage seasons. Medieval pilgrimage remains one of the most misunderstood aspects of the period. Modern observers sometimes imagine it as purely religious travel detached from ordinary life. In reality, pilgrimage intersected with commerce, hospitality, transportation, and local economies. Popular pilgrimage routes generated significant movement. Travelers needed food, lodging, animals, guidance, supplies. Entire networks developed to support them. As a result, certain inns experienced periods of intense activity. Their stables filled quickly. Lofts became crowded. Sleeping arrangements grew tighter. The person resting above the animals might share the space with strangers from entirely different backgrounds, different accents, different occupations, different destinations. Yet all were united by the same practical reality. Night had arrived. The road would have to wait until morning. This temporary community created unusual social encounters. Peasant might briefly share space with a merchant, a craftsman with a pilgrim, a local traveler with someone from a distant region. Medieval society was certainly hierarchical, but travel occasionally brought together people who otherwise would never have crossed paths. The stable participated in these encounters simply because it sat at the center of transportation, and transportation sat at the center of connection. There is another side to this story, however. Not all travelers arrived peacefully. Roads carried uncertainty. Banditry existed. Disputes occurred. Suspicion accompanied strangers. An innkeeper often had to balance hospitality with caution. Who was trustworthy? Who could pay? Who might cause trouble? The stable again played a role. Animals revealed information. A well-maintained horse suggested one set of circumstances. A poorly equipped traveler suggested another. The quality of tack, saddles, packs, and animals all provided clues. Experienced innkeepers and stable workers learned to read such details. Not perfectly, but often effectively. The stable functioned almost like an informal screening area. Before anyone entered the social center of the inn, their animals arrived first. Their equipment arrived first. Their practical circumstances became visible. The sleeper above the stable occupied a position from which these small judgments unfolded nightly, not through dramatic confrontations, mostly through observation. Observation was one of the most valuable skills in medieval life. Without modern documentation systems, people frequently relied upon appearance, behavior, reputation, and experience to make decisions. A stable worker noticing an exhausted horse understood something about the journey behind it. A merchant inspecting another merchant's animals could estimate likely carrying capacity. A traveler observing local stock learned something about regional agriculture. Knowledge accumulated through attention. The stable rewarded attention. It also exposed people to weather in ways modern travelers rarely experience. Weather shaped every journey. Heavy rain transformed roads. Snow delayed movement. Floods altered routes. Extreme heat exhausted animals. Storms damaged infrastructure. Travelers arriving at an inn often carried evidence of weather directly on their bodies and equipment. Mud splashed across clothing. Wet cloaks dripped onto floors. Horses arrived tired from difficult conditions. The stable absorbed these realities. Sleeping above it meant sharing in them indirectly. Even after the traveler settled down, the smell of wet leather might remain. The sound of rain on the roof might continue through the night. The atmosphere inside the building reflected conditions outside. There was no complete separation. The medieval world tended to blur boundaries we often take for granted. Work and home, human and animal, private and public, travel and lodging, day and night. The stable sat precisely at several of those intersections. And because it occupied such a central position, it often became one of the most revealing spaces in everyday life. Consider the simple act of departure. Morning arrives. The animals below begin moving. Travelers prepare for the road. Feed bags are checked. Loads adjusted. Straps tightened. Horses groomed. What seems routine actually represents an enormous amount of accumulated knowledge. A poorly balanced load could injure an animal. A neglected hoof could shorten a journey. An improperly secured pack might spill miles later. Travel depended upon preparation. Preparation depended upon experience. And experience often developed through countless mornings spent around stables. The sleeper above absorbed this education simply by proximity. Day after day, season after season, year after year, the rhythms became familiar. Soon enough, one could identify activities by sound alone. The scrape of a grooming brush, the clink of metal fittings, the rustle of hay, the steady chewing of animals before departure, the opening of large stable doors. These sounds formed part of the acoustic landscape of medieval life. Modern people often think of history visually. Paintings, buildings, artifacts, yet sound shaped experience just as profoundly. And the stable possessed a distinctive soundscape. Hooves against wood, harness buckles, breathing animals, moving straw, occasional snorts and stamps. Human voices softened by timber walls. The person sleeping above these sounds did not merely hear them. Over time, they became background reality. As familiar as running water or distant traffic might seem today, that familiarity produced another subtle consequence. It reduced loneliness. This may seem surprising given the physical conditions involved. Yet many medieval sleeping arrangements were communal by modern standards. People often shared rooms, halls, or sleeping spaces. Privacy existed, but was unevenly distributed. The stable loft, despite its discomforts, placed a person within a web of living presence. Animals below, travelers nearby, household activities surrounding them. Silence was rarely complete. For some individuals, especially those accustomed to such environments, total quiet might have felt stranger than gentle noise. The stable sounds became reassurance, evidence that life continued normally, evidence that responsibilities remained intact, evidence that tomorrow would arrive much like yesterday, unless, of course, something disrupted the pattern. And that possibility lingered constantly beneath the surface. Because roads carried more than merchants and pilgrims. They carried soldiers, officials, tax collectors, messengers bearing urgent news, refugees fleeing local crises. Entire currents of medieval history sometimes moved along the same routes used by ordinary travelers. Most nights passed without incident, but occasionally a stable found itself unexpectedly close to events much larger than the daily routines it normally supported. A horse arrives after dark, lathered with sweat. Another follows. Voices are hurried. Equipment is unloaded quickly. The atmosphere changes. Even before explanations are offered, experienced workers sense that something unusual has happened. The stable feels different. The travelers feel different. And for the person lying awake in the loft above, listening through the floorboards as unfamiliar voices exchange urgent information below, the ordinary rhythms of the road begin to give way to something else entirely. And for the person lying awake in the loft above, listening through the floorboards as unfamiliar voices exchange urgent information below, the ordinary rhythms of the road begin to give way to something else entirely. Most medieval people did not experience major historical events the way modern audiences often imagine them. There was rarely a clear announcement that history was changing. No headline arrived. No broadcast interrupted the evening. More often, change appeared gradually, carried by travelers, rumors, merchants, officials, and riders arriving after dark. The stable frequently encountered those signals first. A horse arriving hard-ridden late at night suggested urgency. Several riders arriving together might suggest official business. Animals covered in mud despite dry local conditions hinted at distant storms or difficult roads elsewhere. Even before words were exchanged, the stable offered clues. This was one reason experienced innkeepers paid close attention to the condition of animals. The horse often told a story before its rider did. A well-rested horse implied a measured journey. An exhausted horse implied haste. A frightened horse implied trouble. A horse carrying unfamiliar equipment might suggest a traveler from far beyond the local region. People who worked around stables became surprisingly skilled observers of such details, not because they possessed special training, but because repetition sharpened perception. Day after day, year after year, they encountered travelers in transit. Patterns emerged. The unusual became noticeable. The ordinary became predictable. The stable transformed observation into practical knowledge. For the sleeper above, especially someone who worked there regularly, the sounds drifting upward could gradually acquire meaning. A routine arrival sounded one way. An unusual arrival sounded another. The difference might be subtle. The pace of footsteps, the tone of conversation, the speed with which animals were unloaded, the urgency with which feed or water was requested, the number of people moving through the yard. Such details rarely appear in chronicles, yet they shaped how ordinary people experienced the wider world. History often entered daily life quietly. Imagine an inn situated near a significant trade route. Not a grand establishment, merely a respectable one serving travelers passing between towns. On most nights, arrivals occur steadily. Merchants discuss prices. Pilgrims discuss shrines. Farmers discuss weather. Then one evening the pattern changes. Several riders arrive unusually late. Their horses are exhausted. The stable suddenly becomes active despite the hour. Someone requests fresh mounts. Another asks about road conditions ahead. Conversations lower into whispers. No one announces that important news has arrived. Yet everyone senses something. The atmosphere shifts. This shift is difficult to describe, but anyone who has spent time within a close-knit working environment may recognize it. Human beings often perceive significance before they fully understand it. The stable, despite its practical function, became one of the places where such perceptions emerged. Roads carried information. Information carried uncertainty. Uncertainty generated attention. A person trying to sleep above the stable might not hear every word below, but they would notice the unusual energy. Perhaps they drift back to sleep eventually. Perhaps they remain awake longer than usual. Either way, the stable has once again become more than a shelter for animals. It has become a point of contact between local life and larger events. This relationship worked in both directions. The stable connected the wider world to the household, but it also connected the household to the wider world. News moved outward as well as inward. A merchant departing in the morning carried stories gathered the night before. A pilgrim shared observations from one region in another. An official transmitted instructions. Information traveled because people traveled. And people traveled because animals made travel possible. The stable sat quietly beneath this entire system. There is a tendency in modern history to focus on institutions. Kingdoms, governments, churches, armies. These certainly mattered. Yet institutions ultimately depended upon movement. Orders had to be delivered. Taxes had to be collected. Messages had to arrive. Supplies had to reach destinations. Before mechanized transportation, animal power made these activities possible. The stable therefore occupied a position far more central than its humble appearance might suggest. Sleeping above it meant sleeping above one of the engines of medieval society. This becomes especially clear when considering seasonal rhythms. Travel patterns changed dramatically throughout the year. Winter often reduced movement. Roads became difficult. Daylight shortened. Weather increased risks. In many regions, activity slowed. The stable reflected this change. Fewer arrivals. Longer stays. Greater emphasis on preserving animals through harsh conditions. The atmosphere became more inward-looking. Then spring arrived. Roads improved. Trade increased. Pilgrims resumed journeys. Markets expanded. The stable awakened alongside the landscape. Fresh travelers appeared. New animals entered the yard. Conversations multiplied. Movement returned. Someone sleeping above the stable experienced these seasonal shifts directly. The building sounded different in spring than in winter. Different in harvest season than in late autumn. Different during major fairs than during ordinary weeks. The stable served almost like a calendar written in sound and activity. One month brought merchants. Another brought pilgrims. Another brought agricultural traffic. Another brought officials collecting rents or administering estates. The flow never stopped completely. It merely changed character. This constant variation helped prevent stable work from becoming entirely predictable. Routine existed, certainly. Animals still needed feeding. Stalls still required cleaning. Equipment still demanded maintenance. Yet every new arrival introduced an element of uncertainty. Who were they? Where had they come from? What conditions existed beyond the local area? What news did they carry? Even if such questions remained unanswered, they lingered. The stable became a place where horizons briefly widened. This was particularly important in an era when many people traveled relatively little themselves. A villager might spend most of life within a familiar landscape. Yet through travelers passing through local inns, fragments of distant places arrived regularly. Descriptions of larger towns, reports from markets, stories of unusual events, accounts of weather elsewhere, news of political developments. The stable often heard these things first, not formally, not systematically, but organically, one conversation at a time, one horse at a time, one evening at a time. The sleeper above the stable occupied a curious position in this process. Neither fully participant nor fully observer. Close enough to hear, distant enough to remain separate. That perspective offers an interesting lens through which to understand medieval life itself. Most people were not decision-makers at the highest levels of society. They were observers of decisions made elsewhere. Yet those decisions still affected them. A war declared far away could increase taxation. A failed harvest in another region could alter prices. Political instability could disrupt trade routes. Disease could restrict movement. The stable became one place where the consequences of distant events gradually appeared, often before official explanations arrived. Consider a period of military activity. Armies required horses. Messengers traveled more frequently. Officials moved between regions. Supply networks became busier. Road traffic changed. An observant innkeeper might notice unusual patterns long before understanding their full significance. More riders than usual, greater urgency, different destinations, increased demand for lodging. The stable recorded these changes in practical terms, not through written reports but through activity. This reminds us that history is often experienced indirectly. People rarely perceive the full shape of events while living through them. They notice symptoms first. Changes in routine, changes in prices, changes in travel patterns, changes in conversation. The stable reflected all of these, and because it reflected them, it became a remarkably sensitive indicator of broader conditions. There was another aspect to stable life that deserves attention. Trust. Travel depended upon trust to a surprising degree. Travelers entrusted animals to innkeepers. Merchants entrusted goods to storage spaces. Households entrusted stable workers with valuable property. Trust could be earned slowly and lost quickly. A reliable stable became part of a community's reputation. Word spread. Travelers remembered. Merchants returned. Pilgrims recommended particular establishments. The quality of animal care mattered. This fact may seem mundane, yet it reveals something profound about medieval society. Much of life depended upon relationships rather than systems. Formal institutions existed, certainly, but countless daily transactions relied upon reputation. Would the horse be fed properly? Would equipment remain secure? Would travelers be treated fairly? The answers shaped behavior. An inn with a trustworthy stable attracted business. An unreliable one struggled. The person sleeping above the stable participated in this economy of trust whether they realized it or not. Perhaps they worked there. Perhaps they simply lodged there temporarily. Either way, they occupied a space built upon confidence in human behavior. This confidence was never perfect. Theft occurred. Fraud occurred. Neglect occurred. Yet cooperation remained essential. Without cooperation, travel became far more difficult. Without travel, communication slowed. Without communication, broader society suffered. The stable, therefore, served not only economic functions but social ones as well. It connected strangers through practical necessity. And practical necessity often created unexpected forms of community. A traveler arriving late at night might receive assistance from people they had never met before. A horse might be cared for by strangers. Directions might be offered freely. News exchanged casually. These interactions were not always warm or idealized. Medieval society contained conflict, suspicion, and inequality, yet everyday cooperation remained remarkably important. The stable embodied that reality. It was a workplace, certainly, a storage area, an animal shelter, but it was also a meeting point, a place where countless small acts of assistance occurred. Feed provided, water carried, equipment repaired, advice shared, animals watched, journeys supported. Most of these acts never entered written records, yet they made larger systems possible. As evening returned once again to the countryside, the familiar cycle repeated itself. Travelers approached along fading roads. Animals entered the yard. Stable doors opened. Hay shifted. Water splashed into troughs. The loft above prepared to receive another night's occupants. Perhaps a local worker climbed the ladder carrying a blanket. Perhaps a merchant settled in after a long day. Perhaps a servant remained close to valuable horses. The reasons varied. The arrangement endured, because beneath all the smells, sounds, inconveniences, and discomforts lay a simple truth. The stable remained one of the safest places to stay near what mattered most. Warmth, animals, property, transportation, work, security, all gathered beneath the same roof. And as darkness settled over the building once more, another group of travelers arrived through the gate, bringing with them fresh horses, unfamiliar accents, and news from roads stretching far beyond the horizon of the village that would host them for the night. And as darkness settled over the building once more, another group of travelers arrived through the gate, bringing with them fresh horses, unfamiliar accents, and news from roads stretching far beyond the horizon of the village that would host them for the night. The arrival of strangers was one of the few things capable of briefly transforming the atmosphere of an otherwise familiar stable. Animals noticed it, dogs noticed it, workers noticed it. Even those attempting to sleep above the loft often noticed it. New horses brought new sounds. Every animal had its own habits. Some settled quickly after being watered and fed. Others remained restless long into the evening. Certain horses pawed at the ground repeatedly. Others snorted at unfamiliar animals nearby. Some reacted to every disturbance. Others seemed almost indifferent to their surroundings. To someone accustomed to the stable's ordinary rhythms, these differences stood out immediately. This is one of the details often lost when we think about medieval animals. Horses were not interchangeable units of transportation. They possessed individual temperaments. Medieval people knew this intimately because they worked with them every day. A groom could identify a horse simply by the pattern of its behavior. An experienced stable hand often knew which animal was likely to remain calm during a storm, which might become nervous around unfamiliar noises, and which would attempt to investigate every new arrival. Sleeping above such animals meant sharing a building with dozens of distinct personalities. The stable below was never merely a storage space. It was a community of living creatures, and those creatures shaped the quality of sleep more than many people might imagine. A quiet horse could make for a quiet night. A restless horse could ensure that everyone nearby remained aware of its presence. Yet medieval people adapted remarkably well to these conditions. Familiarity changes perception. Sounds that would keep a modern visitor awake might barely register to someone who had lived around livestock for years. The same principle applies in many environments. A person raised near the sea becomes accustomed to the constant sound of waves. Someone living near a railway may eventually stop noticing passing trains. In the medieval stable loft, people became accustomed to animals. The sounds merged into the background of daily life. What truly captured attention was not noise itself but unusual noise. A horse kicking repeatedly, animals becoming agitated together, sudden silence. These departures from normality mattered. Once again, the stable rewarded attentiveness. This attentiveness extended beyond the animals themselves. Travelers often brought unfamiliar equipment, clothing, and goods into the stable yard. Before anyone entered the inn's main hall, their possessions passed through the working spaces around the animals. A merchant's pack horse might carry textiles from distant towns. A trader might transport spices, metal goods, tools, wax, salt, or wine. A pilgrim might carry only a modest bundle. A messenger might travel light, prioritizing speed over comfort. The stable therefore offered a glimpse into economic life far beyond the local community. The person sleeping above the stable might never visit a major trading center. Yet through the travelers arriving below, pieces of those distant worlds entered the building regularly. The smell of imported goods, the appearance of unfamiliar fabrics, stories attached to distant roads. The stable became a point where local life met wider networks. This was particularly true in market regions. Many medieval towns hosted regular fairs or trading events that attracted visitors from considerable distances. During these periods, stable space became precious. Animals filled every available corner. Temporary accommodations appeared. Haylofts became crowded. The ordinary balance between comfort and necessity shifted even further toward necessity. Imagine arriving during one of these busy periods. The inn is already full. The common hall buzzes with conversation. The stable yard contains animals from multiple regions. Lantern light flickers across damp cobblestones. Workers move continuously between buildings. And somewhere above it all, people attempt to sleep among the stored hay. Such nights were probably far from restful by modern standards. Yet they reveal something important about medieval attitudes toward accommodation. Perfect comfort was rarely expected. Adequate shelter was the goal. A roof, relative safety, reasonable warmth, protection from weather. These priorities often outweighed concerns about silence or privacy. The stable loft delivered many of those essentials. Not elegantly, but effectively. And effectiveness mattered. One reason this arrangement persisted for centuries is that medieval people were often extremely practical when evaluating living conditions. They understood trade-offs because daily life constantly required them. Would you prefer more privacy or more warmth? More space or greater security? Better air circulation or better protection from cold? These choices were not theoretical. They emerged directly from available resources. The stable loft represented one answer among many, an imperfect solution to multiple problems. Its persistence suggests that many people found the balance acceptable, or at least acceptable enough. There is a subtle distinction there. History sometimes suffers when we assume that people either loved or hated particular conditions. Reality tends to be more complicated. Most people simply adapted. They recognized advantages. They recognized disadvantages. Then they continued with life. Sleeping above a stable likely fell into that category for many individuals. Not ideal, not unbearable, simply part of the world. The more closely we examine medieval daily life, the more often we encounter this pattern. People were remarkably skilled at making workable arrangements from limited options. The stable itself reflected that skill. Every feature served multiple purposes. The lower level sheltered valuable animals. The upper level stored fodder. The combined structure conserved space. The animals contributed warmth. The loft provided storage and occasionally sleeping quarters. Nothing was wasted if it could be avoided. This efficient use of space became especially important in areas where resources were constrained. Building materials required labor. Land had value. Maintenance consumed time. Every structure represented investment. Combining functions therefore made practical sense. To modern eyes, mixing animals and sleeping quarters may appear unsanitary. And by modern standards, it often was. Yet medieval people evaluated the arrangement differently. They measured benefits against risks. Warmth mattered. Security mattered. Accessibility mattered. The stable offered all three. This practical reasoning becomes even clearer when we consider weather. A severe storm could completely alter perceptions of comfort. Imagine heavy rain hammering against the roof throughout the night, wind pressing against walls, cold air sweeping across the countryside. In such conditions, the loft above a stable might feel considerably more appealing than exposed alternatives. The animals below generated heat. The structure provided shelter. The hay offered insulation. Suddenly, the arrangement's advantages became more obvious. Context mattered. And context is often what modern observers miss when judging historical living conditions. The question medieval people asked was rarely, "Is this ideal?" More often it was, "Is this better than the alternatives?" The stable loft frequently passed that test. Its value became particularly apparent during winter. Long winter nights transformed perceptions of space. Darkness arrived early. Work compressed into shorter daylight hours. Travel became more difficult. Communities turned inward. The stable assumed greater importance. Animals required protection from cold. Stored fodder became increasingly precious. Every successful winter represented months of preparation paying off. Sleeping above the stable during winter meant living close to those preparations. The hay stacked nearby represented summer labor preserved for future use. The animals below represented investments protected against harsh conditions. The entire building embodied planning. This connection between present comfort and past labor was far more visible in medieval life than it often is today. Modern systems frequently conceal the processes supporting daily existence. Medieval systems remained visible. The hay in the loft had been cut, dried, gathered, transported, and stored by human effort. The horse below required continuous care. The building itself demanded maintenance. Nothing operated automatically. The sleeper above the stable remained surrounded by reminders of this reality. Even the smells reflected labor. Fresh hay carried memories of summer fields. Leather tack reflected skilled craftsmanship. Wooden beams reflected forestry and construction. The stable was filled with evidence of work. Perhaps that is one reason it reveals so much about medieval society. Unlike castles, cathedrals, or battlefields, it existed close to the daily realities experienced by ordinary people. Most medieval individuals never commanded armies. Most never influenced royal policy. Most never entered chronicles. But many encountered stables. Many worked around animals. Many understood the practical concerns associated with housing, feeding, protecting, and transporting livestock. The stable offers a path into their world. And that world was often more interconnected than modern assumptions allow. A horse resting below the loft tonight might be carrying goods to another town tomorrow. A traveler sleeping nearby might continue a journey spanning hundreds of miles. Information exchanged during supper might reach a distant region weeks later. Movement linked communities together. The stable supported that movement. It sat quietly at the edge of roads, beneath inns, beside farms, behind manor houses, and near market squares, helping to sustain the networks that connected medieval society. This is one of the most interesting reversals in the story. At first glance, sleeping above a stable sounds like a narrow topic about discomfort. Yet the deeper we look, the more the stable reveals itself as a window into transportation, trade, communication, labor, architecture, seasonal planning, animal care, and social relationships. The sleeping loft becomes a vantage point. From above the animals, a person could observe far more than horses. They could observe the movement of an entire civilization. Night after night, season after season, year after year, the roads changed, travelers changed, political circumstances changed, economic fortunes changed. Yet the stable remained, a constant point of contact between movement and rest, between journey and destination, between strangers and hosts. And as another evening deepened beyond the stable walls, one of the newly arrived travelers below began carefully checking his horse a second time before sleep. A small act that seemed ordinary enough, yet one that hinted at a concern important enough to keep both rider and animal alert long after the rest of the yard had started to settle. And as another evening deepened beyond the stable walls, One of the newly arrived travelers below began carefully checking his horse a second time before. Sleep, a small act that seemed ordinary enough, yet one that hinted at a concern important enough to keep both rider and animal alert long after the rest of the yard had started to settle. For the person lying awake above the stable, such behavior would not necessarily seem dramatic. Medieval life taught people to pay attention to practical actions rather than grand displays. A traveler inspecting a horse twice in one evening might mean many things. Perhaps the road ahead was difficult. Perhaps the animal had shown signs of fatigue. Perhaps valuable goods were being transported. Perhaps the rider simply trusted caution more than luck. Whatever the reason, experienced observers understood that care rarely appeared without cause. This attitude was common throughout the medieval world. People lived in environments where small oversights could create large consequences. A loose strap might become a lost load. A neglected hoof might become a lame horse. A damaged will might halt a journey. Practical attention often mattered more than boldness. The stable reinforced this lesson every day. Nothing in it functioned automatically. Feed had to be measured. Water had to be carried. Bedding had to be changed. Equipment required maintenance. Animals required observation. The work was repetitive, but the repetition itself carried value. By performing familiar tasks carefully, people reduced uncertainty. There is a tendency to imagine medieval life as dominated by sudden crises. Crises certainly occurred, yet most survival depended upon routine. The stable was a monument to routine. Every morning began with familiar responsibilities. Every evening ended with familiar responsibilities. The repetition could feel endless. Yet within that repetition existed security. A well-maintained stable reduced risk. A neglected one accumulated it. The difference might not be visible immediately, but over time it became obvious. A healthy horse rarely happened by accident. A reliable team of oxen reflected consistent care. Good fodder storage reflected planning. Even the condition of the building itself revealed something about those responsible for it. Loose boards, leaking roofs, damaged stalls, and rotting timbers all communicated information. The stable spoke continuously to those who knew how to read it. This is one reason medieval people often possessed practical forms of expertise that modern observers underestimate. A stable hand might never write a book, never hold political office, never appear in a chronicle, yet he might understand animal behavior with extraordinary precision. He might recognize illness before obvious symptoms appeared. He might judge weather from subtle changes in livestock behavior. He might estimate the condition of roads simply by examining arriving horses. Knowledge existed in many forms. The stable gathered a remarkable amount of it beneath one roof. For travelers, this local expertise could prove invaluable. Road conditions changed constantly. Bridges failed. Floods altered routes. Seasonal weather transformed familiar paths. A newcomer arriving after dark often needed information, and information flowed naturally through places where animals were cared for. Before maps became widely available, knowledge frequently traveled person to person. Which road remained passable? Which ford could still be crossed? Where might fresh horses be found? Which village offered reliable lodging? The stable served as one of the many places where such practical intelligence circulated. A traveler might spend only one night there, yet that single evening could provide enough information to shape the next stage of a journey. This made the stable something more than a shelter. It became part of a larger communication network. Not formal, not organized, yet remarkably effective. Hundreds of small conversations linked communities together. The process unfolded so gradually that participants likely rarely considered its broader significance. Yet the cumulative effect was enormous. News moved, goods moved, people moved, ideas moved. Animals made much of that movement possible. And wherever animals moved, stables followed. The relationship between mobility and infrastructure becomes clearer the longer we remain in this environment. Today, transportation networks often appear distant from daily life. Roads, railways, airports, and logistics systems operate largely beyond immediate view. In the medieval world, transportation remained highly visible. The horse stood in front of you. The cart stood in front of you. The fodder stood in front of you. The labor required to support movement remained impossible to ignore. Sleeping above a stable meant sleeping directly above part of that infrastructure. It was not hidden. You could hear it breathing. Perhaps this is one reason the experience feels so striking to modern audiences. It compresses multiple layers of medieval life into a single image. The smell of hay, the warmth of animals, the creaking floorboards, the presence of travelers, the demands of work, the uncertainty of the road, all coexist in one place. The loft above the stable becomes a crossroads of practical realities. And practical realities often reveal history more clearly than grand narratives. Consider the simple matter of time. Modern people frequently organize their lives according to clocks. Medieval people certainly measured time, but daily rhythms often followed different cues. Sunrise, sunset, seasonal change, religious observances, work requirements, animal needs. These forces shaped schedules. The stable operated according to several of them simultaneously. Animals expected care at regular intervals. Travelers sought to maximize daylight. Farm work followed seasonal demands. As a result, the stable often woke before many other parts of the community. The first sounds of morning frequently emerged there. A door opening, a bucket being lifted, a horse shifting in anticipation of feed. For someone sleeping above, these sounds formed a natural alarm. Not because anyone intended them as such, because life itself demanded activity. The modern distinction between workplace and sleeping space was often less rigid than we imagine. Many medieval people slept near their labor. Artisans lived above workshops. Farmers lived near animals. Servants remained close to their responsibilities. The stable loft reflected this pattern. Rest occurred within reach of work. This arrangement offered advantages and disadvantages. Convenience increased. Privacy decreased. Responsibility remained nearby. Distance between obligation and sleep narrowed. That closeness shaped mental habits as well. A stable worker retiring for the night could not entirely forget tomorrow's tasks. The animals remained beneath him. The evidence of unfinished work remained visible. The next day had already begun to take shape. This continuity between evening and morning helps explain why medieval routines often appear so disciplined. Many responsibilities simply could not be postponed. A horse required care whether the worker felt motivated or not. Feed had to be distributed. Water had to be carried. Animals depended upon consistency. Consistency therefore became a virtue. The stable rewarded reliability. And because it rewarded reliability, it influenced behavior. People adapted themselves to the demands of the environment. Over time, those adaptations became normal. What appears difficult from a modern perspective often felt ordinary to those living within it. This is an important reminder whenever we examine historical daily life. The goal is not to romanticize discomfort, nor is it to exaggerate hardship. The goal is understanding. People generally become skilled at living within the conditions available to them. Medieval people were no exception. A person raised around stables learned things almost automatically. How to move safely around animals. How to judge their moods. how to recognize trouble, how to sleep despite noise, how to wake quickly when necessary. Knowledge accumulated through exposure. By adulthood, many individuals possessed abilities that would seem specialized today. The stable functioned almost as a school without classrooms. Every day offered lessons. Some were learned gradually. Others were learned immediately after mistakes. The consequences of carelessness around large animals could be memorable. Respect developed naturally. Not fear exactly, but awareness. The awareness that animals were living partners in work rather than simple tools. This relationship between humans and animals deserves particular attention. Modern societies often separate animals into categories: pets, livestock, wildlife. The medieval world certainly recognized distinctions, but everyday interaction with working animals was far more common. People spent significant portions of life around horses, oxen, cows, sheep, pigs, and other livestock. They observed them daily, depended upon them daily, adjusted routines around them daily. Sleeping above a stable placed a person inside that relationship even while resting. The animal was never entirely absent. His presence shaped the building, the temperature, the sounds, the smells, the schedule, the economy. The stable demonstrates how deeply integrated animals were into medieval life. Without them, many familiar structures of society would have functioned very differently. Travel would slow, agriculture would suffer, trade would contract, communication would become more difficult. The consequences would spread outward rapidly. And because animals mattered so much, the people caring for them occupied important positions within local communities. Not always prestigious positions, but important ones. A skilled groom could be highly valued. A knowledgeable stable master could become indispensable. Reliable workers built reputations. The quality of animal care produced visible results. Healthy horses, efficient transport, successful journeys, satisfied travelers. These outcomes mattered. In some cases, livelihoods depended upon them. This practical importance helps explain why many medieval estates, monasteries, towns, and inns devoted considerable attention to stable management. The details varied. The principles remained similar. Protect the animals. Protect the investment. Protect the work they make possible. Everything else followed from there. And so the night continued. The traveler below eventually completed his second inspection. The horse settled. The stable quieted once more. Above, sleepers shifted beneath blankets and cloaks. Outside, darkness spread across roads that would not fully awaken again until dawn. The building returned to familiar sounds. Slow breathing, occasional movement, wood adjusting to changing temperatures. Yet beneath the apparent stillness, countless connections remained in motion. Journeys paused but did not end. Trade paused but did not end. Messages paused but did not end. The stable existed in the brief interval between one day's movement and the next, a temporary resting place within a much larger flow. And somewhere beyond the village, another rider was already approaching through the darkness, following a road that would bring horse, news, and fresh demands to the stable before the night was over. And somewhere beyond the village, another rider was already approaching through the darkness, following a road that would bring horse, news, and fresh demands to the stable before the night was over. In many ways, that image is a fitting place to leave our journey. Not because the medieval stable was merely a backdrop to history, but because it was one of the countless places where history quietly happened. When most people picture the Middle Ages, they often imagine castles, kings, battles, cathedrals, and famous events. Yet the overwhelming majority of medieval life unfolded elsewhere. It unfolded in fields, workshops, kitchens, roads, market squares, barns, and stables. It unfolded in ordinary places where people worried about weather, work, food, animals, family, and tomorrow's responsibilities. Sleeping above a stable brings us remarkably close to that reality. At first glance, it sounds like a story about discomfort. And certainly there was discomfort. The smells were real. The noise was real. The cold, the insects, the dust, the lack of privacy, and the constant presence of animals were all part of the experience. But as we have seen, the reality was more complicated than simple hardship. The stable offered warmth. It offered security. It offered proximity to valuable animals. It offered shelter from weather. It offered a practical solution in a world where practical solutions mattered enormously. What seems unpleasant to us often made perfect sense to the people who lived with it. That may be one of the most important lessons hidden inside this small corner of medieval life. The past is easiest to misunderstand when we judge it only by modern expectations. Medieval people did not wake each morning comparing their world to ours. They compared it to the alternatives available to them. They adapted to conditions, made calculations, solved problems, and built routines around the realities they faced. The stable was one of those realities. It connected animals and people, work and rest, travel and home, planning and survival. Above all, it connected individuals to the systems that sustained their lives. A person sleeping above a stable could hear the source of transportation beneath them. They could smell the labor that supported agriculture. They could sense the wealth of a household breathing through the floorboards. The boundaries between daily life and the forces that shaped daily life were remarkably thin. In our modern world, many of those connections are hidden. Transportation arrives without visible animals. Heat arrives without visible effort. Food appears without us witnessing the long chain of labor behind it. The medieval stable concealed very little. Its realities were direct, sometimes unpleasant, sometimes reassuring, always practical, and perhaps that is why it remains such a revealing place to visit in the imagination. It reminds us that history is not only the story of extraordinary people. It is also the story of ordinary people navigating ordinary nights. A stable hand checking a horse before sleep. A traveler listening to unfamiliar animals below the loft. An innkeeper ensuring feed was available before dawn. A groom waking in darkness to begin another day's work. These moments rarely entered official records. Yet they formed the texture of medieval existence. They were the countless small actions upon which larger events ultimately depended. Every messenger needed a horse. Every merchant needed transport. Every estate needed labor. Every journey needed a place to stop. The stable stood quietly at the center of those needs. And somewhere in the darkness of the medieval world, while roads stretched between villages and towns, while travelers followed uncertain routes beneath changing skies, countless people settled into lofts above animals for another night's sleep, trusting rough timber floors, warm rising air, and familiar sounds to carry them safely toward morning. If there is one final question worth considering, it might be this: what part of medieval daily life would feel hardest for you to adapt to? The lack of privacy, the constant proximity to animals, the physical labor, the uncertainty of travel, or perhaps the realization that comfort was often something negotiated rather than expected. History becomes most interesting when we imagine not only what happened, but what it actually felt like to live inside it. And for the people who slept above medieval stables, that feeling was rarely one of romance or misery alone. It was simply life. Thank you for spending this time wandering through the quieter corners of the medieval world. If you enjoyed this journey into everyday history, you're very welcome to return for another one soon. There are always more roads to follow, more ordinary lives to uncover, and more hidden details waiting in the spaces between the famous events.